Building on Dr. Boyd's presentation is Dr. Aaron Gaines, managing partner at Anatech. His presentation is titled New Knowledge on Soybean Meal and Practical Implications for Feed Formulation.
Thanks, David. Well, unlike Dean, I wasn't here 50 years ago. It was 25 years, Dean. And at that time, I grew up in an era with 3 pounds of synthetic lysine. 97 pounds of corn replaced 100 pounds of soybean meal. So we've come a ways over the 25-year period, and obviously have a lot more to learn. Dean, I want to give you credit really for the advancements we've made on soybean meal. I'm not sure I'm going to do the same thing as you during retirement, but appreciate you digging in and bringing some of these advancements to the forefront. So what I'm going to try to do is take some of the advancements that Dean mentioned and really try to apply them to what does it mean practically in terms of implementation. So we're going to cover 4 categories, the pillars that Dean talked about previously, talk about the energy value of soybean meal, really what energy value to use, talk about the importance of minimum soybean meal inclusion, particularly in late finishing diets. And then we're going to talk about formulation strategies as it relates to swine respiratory disease, as well as the summer carcass dip mitigation. And I think these bottom 2 are pretty timely, given what's going on in the industry with health and also pig prices this summer. So the first question is, what energy value to use for soybean meal? We heard it from Dean. If you look at the net energy value in an academic setting, it was determined to be 82% of corn on a dry matter basis. Obviously, we don't formulate pig diets on a dry matter basis. I do some with deer diets, but I wanted to convert this back to an as-fed basis to kind of bring it to light from a practical standpoint. So I used dry matter content of soybean meal at 87.5%, and then for corn I used 85.5%, trying to get some industry-type values, soybean meal being higher in dry matter. When you do this, the relative energy value moves from 82% on a dry matter basis to nearly 85% on an as-fed basis. If you move to a productive energy estimate, where you use a growth assay to determine the apparent energy of an ingredient, that estimate's 100% of corn on a dry matter basis, again using the same coefficients for dry matter for soybean meal and corn as above. The relative energy value of soybean meal to corn is 102% on an as-fed basis. So we've got this range, anywhere from 85.5% in an academic setting to 102% in a commercial setting. And so if you're in the averages, it's about 94%. And about 2.5 years ago, we did an industry survey. Obviously, some of this information was coming to light. There was commercial systems that were doing productive energy assays themselves. And what we found was that about half the industry had increased the energy value of soybean meal to 97% of corn. And there's going to be some variation in that depending on corn particle size as well as moisture. So as you look at changing the energy value of soybean meal, if you elect to do that, it's not as simple as just going into formulation and increasing the loading value for soybean meal. You really need to look at the impact that it has on that lysine to calorie ratio if you're formulating to a lysine to calorie ratio or even a phosphorus to energy ratio. And so you need to make those adjustments. Thankfully, there's some tools out here to help us make those adjustments. PIC has published a nice tool on their website a couple years ago, and I'm going to get into that tool a little bit here. So what the PIC tool does is it calculates their digestible lysine and phosphorus to net energy curve based on the soybean meal to corn net energy ratio that you choose. And so they give you a range. The default setting for their 2020 requirement curve is 78% energy value of soybean meal relative to corn, and you can go up to 100%. So for this example, I obviously used their 2020 curve at 78%, the value of corn for soybean meal, and then looked at what happens if I increase it to 100%. So the red line's the 2020 curve, the blue line is the 100% curve, and you can see that when you make that adjustment, the lysine to calorie ratio decreases. And then likewise, if you look at the SID lysine level, it also decreases. And so that requirement curve adjustment avoids a soybean meal penalty for less lysine or phosphorus per unit of energy. As we move to minimum soybean meal inclusion, we're taught to formulate to a minimum amino acid ratio, and that ideal pattern of amino acid works really well until it doesn't. And I think we've learned over the years that extreme displacement of soybean meal can result in a loss in performance. And so as a nutritionist, we really need to understand the extent to which soybean meal can be replaced for each phase, and that requires dose response studies using synthetic lysine. Did a lot of those in grad school with James. And if you look at a lot of those studies, one of the things that we learned is that displacement of soybean meal with synthetic amino acids can be extensive, from weaning to about 68 kilograms body weight, or 150 pounds. But after this approximate weight of 150 pounds, particularly at 200 pounds plus, there's a barrier to extensive amino acid usage. And unfortunately, we have not been able to resolve this complication for more than 20 years, and a lot of people have worked on it. It doesn't matter if we try to formulate to equivalent net energy values, or whether we meet or exceed the ideal pattern of amino acids for all 10 essential amino acids. If we add non-essential nitrogen, it's not provided resolution to the problem. So grad students in the audience, you got an opportunity to crack the code, because the rest of us have not. So I want to look at minimum soybean meal as it relates to late finishing diets. I saw Julie out in the audience there earlier, but K-State has published some work here. This is from Holland et al. In 2022. I'll kind of set this up. This is the first experiment in corn soy diets. Again, late finishing, the response criteria is average daily gain. And they looked at graded levels of soybean meal from 5% up to 20%. Also included the L-lysine level. So in that 5% soybean meal diet, that corresponds to 0.53% synthetic lysine as L-lysine HCl. And then the 20% treatment is 0.04% L-lysine. You can see as you increase lysine or increase soybean meal, there was a linear response on average daily gain. A lot of this response is being driven by the fact that the 5% soybean meal treatment had lower average daily gain as compared to the other treatments, about a 10% drop in performance. So you can get into those diets and you might speculate, perhaps something else is limiting. I know in that study they're, pushing up against histidine, and they recognize that in that study. But point being is, at least in a corn soy diet, extreme displacement of soybean meal did result in a loss in performance. Moving to the second experiment, again in late finishing pigs, these were corn soy distillers diets, 25% distillers, looked at levels of soybean meal ranging from 0% up to 16% soybean meal. The L-lysine level in that 0% soybean meal treatment was 0.57%, and the 16% soybean meal treatment 0.07. In this experiment, there were no statistical differences among the treatments. However, there was a numerical decrease in performance for the soybean meal levels that were 4% or 0%, about a 5% drop in performance. The authors concluded from this experiment a minimum soybean meal level of 4 to 8% for diets without and with 25% distillers. And if you look at the highest maximum growth rate in both diet types, that was observed at 8%. And so this begs the question, do I set a minimum soybean meal level in formulation? And that would be a fairly foreign concept to most of us, to set a minimum soybean meal level. But in other parts of the world, they do formulate to minimum soybean meal levels or soybean meal equivalents. So it really raises the question, if you don't want to use minimum soybean meal, are there other formulation options that perhaps most of us are more familiar with? And so what I did was basically compared the corn soy diet versus the corn soy distillers diet at an 8% soybean meal inclusion, where growth rate was maximized just to compare if we set one of these other nutrients or ingredient maxes in the case of L-lysine max, what does that look like? And so option one was to set a crude protein minimum. And so for the corn soy diet, that minimum at 8% soybean meal would be 11% crude protein. And the distiller's diet would be 16%. So a pretty wide range if you're setting a crude protein minimum and you've got high levels of distillers being offered in the diet. Option two, SID, lysine and crude protein max. Nice presentation at this meeting by K-State on SID, lysine and crude protein max. I think it does offer some promise, particularly if ingredients are pretty consistent in formulation as far as that ingredient matrix. But in this scenario, if you've got a corn soy diet versus a diet with high levels of distillers, that lysine CP ratio is 619 for a corn soy diet and 427 with a diet with 25% distillers. Option three, probably familiar to a lot of you, would be to set an L-lysine max. And that corn soy diet, that 8% soybean meal treatment would be 0.41%. And then the distiller's diet would be 0.32%. I think these other formulation options could work versus a minimum soybean meal level. Again, if you're using a consistent ingredient matrix in late finishing diets, i.e. if you're in a corn soy diet or you're feeding low levels of distillers, I think you can get by with some of these other options, and we've been able to get by with it. But it does beg the question, is setting a minimum soybean meal level a better option? Moving into swine respiratory disease suppression. This is where the nutritionists get to help the vets. And I wasn't going to talk about this because it's being recorded, but at the prompting of one of my colleagues, they said, you need to bring this up. So I had a conversation yesterday with a person in the industry. I'm not going to name them. Their name is Chris. But he was out at AASV, and the thing that he mentioned was the amount of PERS and PED that's going on in the industry and how bad it is, and it's only getting worse year after year. But at the end of the meeting, everybody gets an award. So I don't know what we're doing wrong here within the animal science community, but the veterinary community's got it figured out. But here to help the vets on swine respiratory disease, Dean talked about this idea of utilizing soybean meal to help with swine respiratory disease because some of the functional components in soybean meal. And the idea would be to apply high soybean meal diets at the time frame of expected PERS infection and wean pig flows. And you get into the feedstuff papers, Hanor actually executed on some of this. But this is how it would get executed in commercial practice. Basically, you'd have the veterinarians and production teams identify problem pig flows and the period of anticipated infection of those wean pig flows. And the system would have a set of standard diets and high soybean meal diets available for implementation at the feed order desk. Kind of set this up, schematically here. We got a feed desk diet library where you've got the standard diets, your nursery 3, and then finisher 1 through finisher 5. And then you've got the tactical swine respiratory disease soybean meal diets. We've got them identified as nursery 13 through finisher 11 through finisher 15. And so you've got these diets set up in your feed desk, and then you've got to look at your feeding plans. And so in this example below, you've got example A there, that's in healthy pigs, so you'd apply the standard diets. And then in scenario B, you've got pigs that are infected with PERS. And in the first flow of pigs, the anticipated infection is at finisher 11, the first finisher diet. And so placement of that higher soybean meal type formulation would occur in finisher 11, and then it would go through finisher 12 and 13. And then in the second flow of pigs, the anticipated infection is in late nursery pigs. So you'd implement that high soybean meal diet in that late nursery phase, and then continued on to finisher 11. Question that may be going through your mind is, how long do we need to feed these type diets? And that's another area of research. I don't think, at this point, we don't know how long we have to feed these high soybean meal diets relative to decrease in viremia, so that's an area of opportunity to understand a little bit better. Talk about dry distillers feeding, and this is going to lead into the summer carcass weight dip, but I think we got to talk a little bit more about it. As we look at dry distiller's grain, the ethanol boom was about 2007. At that time, we had distillers that was 12% oil, and today we're looking at distillers that is 4% oil or less. And a lot of us are feeding 6 to 8% oil products. And so it does raise the question, are distillers as good a value as in the past? And recently, as you look at some of these low oil distillers, both at the university and commercial trial level, we've seen a reduction in growth performance due to reductions in feed intake with these low oil distillers. And so we don't know what's really causing this, whether it's related to amino acid digestibility or there's some type of anti-nutritional factor that's in the ethanol fermentation process. But the magnitude of the response is variable across studies, and it could depend on the plant source you're using or the amount of distillers that you're using in the diet. So quickly here, this is some data that was presented in 2024, Lazaga, basically looking at 6% oil distillers and finishing diets. They went from 0 to 30% distillers, and there's a linear reduction in growth performance, 5% reduction at 30% inclusion of distillers. Feed conversion got worse, but energy was allowed to float, so that was expected. So what's the economics of distillers? So K-State has got some really nice calculators on their website. Encourage you to check those out. This is a second version of a distiller's calculator that accounts for these low oil distillers in terms of their chemical composition, as well as the impact on growth performance. Quickly here, I just set this up. I basically went in and plugged in current market prices for ingredients as well as pig prices. The price of distillers relative to corn was 112%. And I looked at a scenario of feeding 30% in the early finishing period, 20% in the mid-finishing period, and then 10% late finishing. And to summarize, basically, by feeding distillers, it was $2.18 per pig feed cost savings. So that's what we found on feed costs. But if you look at the impact on carcass weight gain, it was a loss of over 5 pounds. And the income over feed cost is a negative $3.54 per pig. And so I encourage you, if you've not looked at your current distiller source, you might want to take a look at it and make sure they're still delivering the value that you think they are. So this gets us right into summer carcass dip mitigation. Dean pointed out it's a costly issue for swine producers, and the problem is reduced feed intake due to heat stress, and it's made worse by excessive levels of distillers. And it can be further exacerbated if diets are too low in soybean meal. Dean covered this really well, so I'm going to skip over this in terms of diet formulation, changes to ingredients as it relates to minimum soy, as well as the use of distillers, and talk quickly on timing of high growth rate diets for summer harvest pigs. So what this does is this framework uses color coding to shows about when groups of late nursery pigs begin the mitigation diet protocol, relative to when they are going to be marketed, and then when to stop using the mitigation diets. So for example, if pigs are being marketed in June, those pigs need to start on those mitigation diets in February. So systems that have not started looking at mitigation diets, you're about a month behind. So something to pay attention to. And then you'd stop using those diets with late nursery pigs that are getting placed in June because they're going to market in October, kind of outside that window when pigs are worth the most money. So a couple emerging questions is how much soybean meal can I put in the diet? This is a fair question given some of the dynamics going on with synthetic amino acids right now. And then the second question is, will high dietary soybean meal in mid to late finishing diets lead to carcass yield decline? So this data was presented last year. Basically what it shows is that it's got set up as a factorial with 4 levels of soybean meal and then 2 distillers levels, 0 and 30%. And what they found in this study is you go above 30% soybean meal in a corn soy or corn soy distiller's diet, and you see a decrease in performance. That diet contains no synthetic lysine. So yes, you can get too high in soybean meal, at least in grower pigs. Finisher pigs, a little different story. There was no impact on soybean meal inclusion level in diets with or without distillers in these late finishing pigs. On the yield side, as you increase soybean meal, particularly at high levels, you can decrease yield in both a corn soy and a corn soy distiller's diet. This is not a surprise, it's not new information, and it's not clear whether this is due to shrink loss in transit or if it's related to increases in organ or visceral mass, kind of like distillers. But the data, this is some data from Johnson et al. In 2004, suggests that carcass yield is not impacted unless soybean meal exceeds 17.5% on a weighted basis. And that's going from 130 to 280 pounds. If you're at Trey's presentation this morning, that large commercial study with a high soybean meal, they did not lose yield in that study. So key takeaways, if you haven't adjusted soybean meal energy level, opportunity to do that. You need to have a minimum level of soybean meal and late finishing pig diets if you want to maximize growth, recommended 5 to 10%. And then soybean meal could be used as a tool to help mitigate swine respiratory disease. And then also, as I pointed out with distillers, really need to understand your source and what value it's bringing you today. And then also managing soybean meal level to maximize growth and limiting distillers to not reduce feed intake is a key to mitigating the summer carcass weight dip. With that, thank you for your time and patience.
Thank you, Aaron.